Good morning to all. So in the last class we discussed about the topics like the operating systems and the functions of the operating systems. So in this class we have the different types of the operating systems, which includes the Microsoft Windows and the Linux operating system. So basically this is the second topic of this module, which is the third module of this paper, which is the introduction to the software. So regarding the Microsoft Windows and as well as the Linux operating system, both these kind of systems, they allow different types of specifications for the users. So basically the change is the GUI, which is the graphical user interface. So first we have to look upon the topic the Microsoft Windows, the second topic of this module. So the Microsoft Windows is a series of software operating systems and graphical user interfaces produced by Microsoft. Microsoft first introduced an operating environment named the Windows in November 1985 as an add-on to MS-DOS, which is the Microsoft Disk Operating System, in response to the growing interest of these graphical user interfaces. So regarding the Microsoft Windows, the MS-DOS is the earliest forms of this Microsoft Windows operating system, in which Microsoft first introduced an operating environment named the Windows in November 1985 as an add-on to the MS-DOS, which is the Microsoft Disk Operating System. So from 1985 onwards, the Microsoft they introduced different types of this operating system, in which each kind of this operating system have different type of specification or any kind of these updates. So basically the MS-DOS is one of the most popular kind of this Microsoft Windows, which is the earliest form of this Windows operating system. Then the basic intention of this developing these kinds of operating system at regular intervals was to improve the GUI, which is the graphical user interface. Then the Microsoft Windows came to dominate the world's personal computer market, overtaking the Mac OS, which is by the Apple softwares, and also which had been introduced previously. As of April 2014, Windows had approximately 80% of the market share of the client operating systems for usage on the internet. So this survey on the 2014, it signifies that the Windows is one of the most popular kind of this operating system, in which many users they use this kinds of operating system instead of this Mac OS as well as the Linux OS. So the one of the important factor regarding the Microsoft Windows is that all the kind of this operating system, they are the user friendly kind of this operating system by the Windows. For example, from the Microsoft Windows XP onwards, we have a kind of personalized kind of this operating system, which includes the Microsoft XP and then the Windows Vista, then Windows 7 and Windows 8 as well as the Windows 10. And as of April 2014, the most recent versions of Windows for personal computers, for the smartphones, server computers and embedded devices are respectively Windows 8.1, then the Windows Phone 8.1 and also the Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows Embedded 8. So these are some important updates for the Windows operating system as of the 2014. Now we have the Windows 10, which is the latest version of this Microsoft Windows operating system. Then we have the different kinds of this Windows operating system, different versions. So basically the term Windows collectively describes any or all the several generations of Microsoft operating system products. These products are generally categorized as follows, which includes the early versions, then the Windows 3.0 and 3.1X, then the Windows 95, 98 and also the ME, and then the Windows NT family, which is the Windows New Technology family, which includes the Microsoft XP as well as the Microsoft Windows Vista. Then the 64-bit operating system, then the Windows CE, which is the Windows Embedded Compact. Then we have the different kinds of latest versions of the Windows, which includes the Windows 7, Windows 8, then the Windows 8.1 and later the Windows 10, which is the latest update for the Microsoft Windows. So these are the different versions of the Windows that we have to focus on. So first we have the early versions of this Windows, the history of this Windows. So in the category of these early versions of these Windows, we have the Windows 1.0, 2.0 and 2.1X. So these are the different versions of these Windows during the early form, which means from 1981 onwards. So the history of this Windows dates back to September 1981, when the project named the Interface Manager was started. It was announced in November 1983 after the Apple Lisa, but before the Macintosh, and under the name Windows. But Windows 1.0 was not released until the November 1985. The shell of Windows 1.0 was a program known as the MS-DOS executive. Other supplied programs were the calculator, calendar, card file, clipboard viewer, clock, control panel, notepad, paint, Ravesry, terminal and also the write. So the Windows 1.0 did not allow the overlapping the windows due to Apple computer owning this feature. Instead, all windows were titled, only dialog boxes could appear over the windows. So these are the some important factors regarding the earliest forms of this Windows, which includes the Windows 1.0. So from 1981 onwards, the earliest forms of this Windows was developed, in which in 1981 the project named the Interface Manager was started. Later it was announced in 1983 as the a kind of operating system which is named as the Windows, but Windows 1.1 was not released until the 1985. So from 1985 onwards, we have the Windows operating system in different versions. So from Windows 1.0 to now with the Windows 10.1, we have the different types of varieties of Windows are available. So basically, this journey of this Windows operating system was started from the 1985 in its official release. Also, the shell of this Windows 1.1 was a program known by the name MS-DOS executive. So it is also important. Regarding the Windows 1.0, it is based on the program which is the MS-DOS executive, and other supplied programs which includes the calculator, calendar, then the clipboard viewer, clock, control panel, notepad, and also the image viewer. So all these kinds of softwares were available from the Windows 1.0 software onwards. Then the Windows 1.0 did not allow the overlapping windows because due to the Apple computer owning that feature. Instead, they used another kind of that feature, which means instead of all windows were titled, only dialog boxes could appear over the other windows. So this is also an important factor regarding the Windows 1.0. So the first form of this official form of this Windows operating system was the Windows 1.0 from 1985 onwards. Then the Windows 2.0 was released in October 1987 and featured several improvements to the user interface and memory management. Windows 2.0 allowed the application windows to overlap each other and also introduced more sophisticated keyboard shortcuts. It could also make use of the expanded memory, which means that the Windows 2.0 was a kind of updated version of this Windows 1.0, and it was released in the year 1987 October, and featured several improvements to the user interface and also the memory management, and also it introduced some sophisticated keyboard shortcuts, and it could also make the use of the expanded memory. So regarding the Windows 2.1, it was released in two different flavors, which means two variants of this Windows 2.1, which includes the Windows 3.86 and Windows 2.86. So both these kinds of variants of this Windows 2.1, which introduced different kinds of the specification, which also regarding the Windows 2.1, it introduced the kinds of multitask facility for the several DOS programs, and also the paged memory model to emulate the expanded memory using the available extended memory. So this means that there are much improvements in the 2.1 version of this Windows. Then the early versions of Windows were often thought of as simply graphical user interfaces, mostly because they ran on top of the MS-DOS and used it for file system services. So the early forms of this Windows operating system, the intention of these Windows operating system, especially the early versions, were to satisfy these kinds of a good graphical user interfaces only because they ran on top of the MS-DOS and used it for the file system services. So that's regarding a common feature regarding the early versions of this Windows operating system, in which all these kinds of versions of the Windows which runs on the basis of this MS-DOS, and it mainly the intention of this MS-DOS was for the file system services. Unlike the MS-DOS, Windows allowed the users to execute multiple graphical applications at the same time through the cooperative multitasking. So the multitasking was introduced in the Windows versions from the Windows 2.0 onwards. So it means that the multitasking is one of the most important aspects for every kind of this operating system, in which we can handle two or more kind of this process at the same time with the help of this multitasking feature. So this is also a kind of update for the Windows different kinds of these Windows versions. Then now we have the Windows 3.0 and 3.1X. So after the Windows 1.0 we have the 2.0 and 2.1, then the Windows 3.0 and also the 3.1X. So these are the first early forms of this Windows. Then we have the Windows 95, 98 and as well as the ME version. So the Windows 3.0, which was released on 1990, and Windows 3.1, which was released on the 1992, basically it improved the design mostly because the virtual memory and loadable virtual device letters, which allowed them to share the arbitrary devices between the multitask DOS windows. And as well as the for Windows 3.0, Microsoft also rewrote the critical operations from C into the assembly, making this release faster and less memory hungry than its predecessors, which means that basically the Windows 3.0 and 3.1X, both these kinds of operating system were an update for the previous versions of this Windows, which means the Windows 2.0 and also the 2.1X, in which it improved the design mostly because for the virtual memory and also for the loadable virtual device drivers, in which it allowed them to share the arbitrary devices between the multitask DOS windows. So that's regarding the Windows 3.0 and 3.1X, which was released on 1990 and as well as in 1992 respectively. Then we have the Windows 95, 98 and ME. So the Windows 95 was released in 1995, featuring a new user interface, support for long file names up to 255 characters, and the ability to automatically detect and configure the installed hardware, which means the plug and play. So which means the Windows 95 was one of the most popular Windows operating system at that time, in which it gained popularity because they featuring the new user interface, as well as it allowed the users to connect any kind of this external kind of this drivers, and it also automatically detects these kinds of software drivers for the computers, which means that the plug and play kind of that capability of this Windows 95. And also it support for the long file names up to 255 characters. Then it could natively run the 32-bit applications and featured several technological improvements that increased its stability over the Windows 3.1. There were several OEM, which means the original equipment manufacturer service release, which means the OSR of Windows 95. So 95, the model of that Windows 95 were introduced in different kind of these varieties, and each of which was roughly equal to the a common service pack, which was the Windows 95 itself. So that's regarding the Windows 95 operating system. Then now we have the Windows 98, which was released in 1998, and the Microsoft released a second version of this Windows 98 in 1999, named Windows 98 second edition, which is the Windows 98 SE. And in 2000, Microsoft released Windows ME, which means the Millennium Edition, which updated the core from the Windows 98 but adopted some aspects of the Windows 2000 and removed the boot in DOS mode option. It also added a new feature called the System Restore, allowing the user to set the computer settings back to an earlier date. So here we have some improvements in the updates of this Windows, in which from the 2000 onwards we have the wide varieties of Windows were available. So in 1998 the Windows 98 was introduced. Later the second edition of that Windows 98 was introduced in 1999. Later in 2000 Microsoft introduced the ME version, which means the Millennium Edition, which updated the core from the Windows 98 but adopted some aspects of the Windows 2000 and removed the boot in DOS mode. So the boot in DOS mode means the older forms of that boot loader in the Windows OS, and it was improved to a kind of new feature, as well as it also added a new feature called the System Restore, which means allowing the user to set the computer's settings back to the earlier date. So we can back up the data of that computer with the help of this Windows operating system from 2000 onwards. So that's regarding some improvements in the Windows updates. Now we have the Windows NT family. So the Windows NT family means the new technology of this Windows. So the NT family of Windows system was fashioned and marketed the higher reliability of the business use. The first release was MS Windows NT 3.1 in 1993, numbered the 3.1 to match the consumer Windows version, which was followed the 3.5 in 1994, then the 3.51 in 1995, and then the NT 4.0 in 1996. And also later in 2000, Windows introduced the Windows 2000 version, and the 2000 is the last NT based Windows release which does not include the Microsoft product activation. So the last forms of this Windows NT family was during the 2000, in which they released the Windows 2000 as the last edition for the Windows NT family, in which it does not include the Microsoft product activation. So we have to activate the Windows in order to use the Windows regularly in a very good manner. So the NT 4.0 was the first in this line to implement the Windows 95 user interface. And regarding the NT family, the NT 4.0 was the first in this line to implement the Windows 95 user interface. Then Microsoft then moved to combine their consumer and business operating system with the Windows XP. Windows XP coming in both home and professional versions. So basically the Windows XP was also a kind of popular Windows version which is used during that time, in which it was introduced from 2000 onwards, and later the 2003 Windows Server, which is released after half an year after the Windows XP, and the Windows Server up to date with MS Windows XP, and after a lengthy development process, Windows Vista was released towards the end of 2006. Then the Windows Server in 2008, and also the Windows 7 was introduced in 2009. So these are some improvements in the Windows versions family. From 2000 onwards, we have different kinds of these varieties of these Windows are available, which includes the Windows 2000, then the Windows XP, then the Windows Server different types, and as well as the Windows Vista, later the Windows 7 in 2009. So these are the major advancement in the Windows versions of these different kinds of these Windows operating systems. Now we have the 64-bit operating system. We have the Windows 64-bit operating systems. So the Windows NT included the support for the several different platforms before the 86 based personal computer became dominant in the professional world. And on April 25, 2005, Microsoft released the Windows XP Professional in the 64-bit edition and Windows Server also in the 64-bit edition to support both the 64-bit or the 86 kind of that processor. So basically, to support for the 64-bit kind of processors, Windows introduced the update for the Windows XP as well as for the Windows Server 2003, that two versions in the 2005 and update to for the support for the 64-bit operating system. So this is regarding the 64-bit kind of this operating system by the Windows, how Windows introduced these kinds of Windows 64-bit operating systems. So now we have the last version of this Windows that we had to focus on, which is the Windows CE. So Windows CE is officially known by the name Windows Embedded Compact. It is an edition of this Windows for minimalistic computers and embedded systems. And Windows CE is distinctly different operating system and kernel rather than a trimmed down version of this desktop Windows. It is not be confused with the Windows XP Embedded, which is the NT based. Windows CE is supported on the Intel 86 and compatibles MIPS, ARM and Hitachi Super Edge processors. And also regarding the Windows CE, it is optimized for the devices that have minimal storage, and also a Windows CE kernel may run in under the megabyte of memory. So it is a kind of minimal kind of for the system requirements, and it is exclusively for these kinds of minimalistic computers and embedded system, and it is using different kinds of this operating system as well as the kernel rather than a trimmed down version of this desktop Windows. So it is basically different version of this Windows exclusively for these kinds of minimalist computers as well as for the embedded kind of these systems. So these are the major versions of the computer that we should focus on, and later after 2009 we have Windows 8 was released, then the Windows 8.1 was released, and also the latest version of this Windows was introduced in 2015 July. So that's regarding some important aspects regarding the Windows version. So now we have a table which gives a clear idea regarding the release date, the product name of these Windows versions as well as the current version of the Windows. So from November 1985 onwards we have the Windows 1.01 to the Windows 8.1, which was released in 2013, and later we have an addition for that, which is the Windows 10, which was released on July 29, 2015. So these are some important aspects regarding the different kinds of the Windows versions, the product name as well as the release date according to the chronological order. So that's regarding the Windows. So Windows is the kind of most popular kind of this operating system, in which the Windows 95 was one of the among the popular kind of that operating system. Then the Windows XP, later the Windows 7, and many of these operators, they use this Windows 7 as a kind of operating system for them, for their office use as well as for the personal use. And latest edition of this Windows is the Windows 10. So this is regarding the Windows operating system. Now we have the third topic, which is the Linux operating system. So regarding the term the Linux, it is a generic term referring to units like computer operating systems based on the Linux kernel, and their development is one of the most prominent examples of free and open source software collaborations. Typically all the underlying source code can be used, freely modified and redistributed both commercially and non-commercially by anyone under the licenses such as the GNU, which is the General Public License, and the name Linux comes from the Linux kernel, originally written in 1991 by Linus Torvalds. So basically regarding the operating system, which is the Linux, which was introduced in 1991 by Linus Torvalds, it is a free as well as a open source kind of operating system, in which we can develop that software, that any kind of that forms of this Linux operating system at free of cost, and also we can redistribute it. So both commercially and non-commercially by anyone under the licenses such as the GNU, the General Public License, and the GNU means GNU is not Unix. So the name Linux comes from the term the Linux kernel, and also it was originally written in 1991 by Linus Torvalds. So these are the major aspects regarding the Linux operating system, in which it is a generic term referring to the Unix-like computer operating systems based on the Linux kernel. So it is entirely different kinds of this operating system. While we discuss regarding the Windows OS, there is a different kinds of graphical user interface used in the Windows OS. So now we have the Linux OS, which is also a different types of this operating system, and basically it is a free as well as we can redistribute, we can develop that kind of operating system in a very systematic manner. So we have different kinds of Linux operating systems are available, and Linux can be installed on a wide variety of computer hardware ranging from the embedded devices such as the mobile phones, smartphones and wristwatches to mainframes and supercomputers. And Linux is predominantly known for its user in the servers. In 2007, the Linux overall share of this server market was estimated at 12.7%, while in 2008 the estimate suggested that 60% of all the web servers ran on the Linux kernel, and most desktop computers run either Mac OS X or the Microsoft Windows, with the Linux having only 1 to 2% of the desktop market. However, the desktop use of this Linux has become increasingly popular in recent years, partly owing to the popular Ubuntu distribution and the emergence of the netbooks and the smartbooks. So the Ubuntu is also a kind of variety of this Linux operating system, and it made some popularity for the Linux operating systems. And typically the Linux is packaged in a format known as a Linux distributing for the desktop and server use, and the Linux distributions include the Linux kernel and all of the supporting software required to run a complete system, such as the utilities and libraries. So it is also a very important factor regarding the Linux operating system, in which it is preloaded with these kinds of the utilities as well as the basic softwares for the operating systems. And the X Windows system, is a computer software system and network protocol that provides the GUI for the networked computers, and it provides the windowing on computer displays and manages the keyboard and pointing device control functions. So the X Windows system is used in the Linux operating system. So it is basically for the a decent amount of this GUI kind of that functionality. And the GNOME, the GNU Network Object Model Environment, and the KDE, K Desktop Environment, whereas the K stands for nothing, and the desktop environments and the Apache HTTP server, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and commonly used applications with the desktop Linux system include the Mozilla Firefox web browser and the OpenOffice.org for the Office use, the Office suite which is in the Linux software. So we have some important aspects regarding the Linux operating system, in which it is a free and also a redistributable, and we can develop that operating system, and we have different forms of the Linux software, Linux operating systems are available, including the Ubuntu operating system. And one important factor regarding the Linux distributions is that it comes preloaded with the basic softwares as well as these kinds of utilities for the computer, in which there is no kind of additional software is required for the basic functionality of this operating system, which is the Linux. So we have the history of the Linux, which is the first topic under the Linux operating system. So the Linux was introduced in 1991, and it has grown from a small number of C files under the license prohibiting the commercial distributions to its stage in 2009 of over the 370 megabytes of source under the GNU, which is the General Public License. Then the GNU project, started in 1983 by Richard Stallman, had the goal of creating a complete Unix compatible software system called the GNU, which is the GNU is not Unix, and composed entirely of free software. And many programs and utilities were contributed by developers around the world, and by 1991 most of the components of the system were ready, and still missing was the kernel. So from 1983 Richard Stallman introduced the GNU project, and later it is developed from the 1991 onwards, in which the Linus Torvalds invented the Linux itself. So in 1991 Torvalds was a student of University of Helsinki in Finland, where he had been using the Minix, a non-free Unix-like system, and began writing his own kernel. And he started by developing the device drivers and hard drive access, and by September had a basic design that he called version 0.01, and this kernel, which is called the Linux, was afterwards combined with the GNU system to produce a complete free operating system. So from 1991 onwards, Linus Torvalds, the developer of this Linux, he just introduced these kinds of different forms of this Linux operating system, in which he introduced the kernel by himself, and also he was used these kinds of Unix-like operating system, but it was a non-free operating system, and because of that he began writing his own kernel, and he started by developing the device drivers and hard drive access. By September he had a basic design that he called version 0.01, and on October 5th 1991 Torvalds sent a posting to the Combos OS Minutes, the new group, announcing the release of the version 0.02, a basic version that still needed a minutes to operate, but which attracted the considerable interest nevertheless. And on January 5th 1992 the Linux version 0.12 was released, an improved stable kernel, and the next release was called the version 0.95. That Linux became an underground phenomenon, and Torvalds released the version 0.11 under the freeware license of his own devising, but then released the version 0.12. So we have the different kinds of the kernels from 0.01 to 0.12 by Linus Torvalds, which means different kinds of this OS, the developing of this OS, and from 0.12 onwards he developed different forms of this Linux OS, and Linux continued to be improved through the 1990s and started to be used as a large scale application like the web hosting, networking, and database serving, proving ready for the production use. And version 2.2, a major update to the Linux kernel, was officially released on January 1999. So on January 1999 the Linux 2.2 was introduced, which is a improved form of this previous versions of this Linux. By the year 2000, most computer companies supported the Linux in one way or another, recognizing a common standard that could finally reunify the fractured world of this Unix wars. The next major release was version 2.4 in January 2001, providing the compatibility with the upcoming generations of the Intel 64-bit Itanium computer processors. So these are the major development while we going through the history of the Linux. And in 2000, with the version of this 2.4 of this Linux, it supported the 64-bit operating system. So that's regarding a quick overview regarding the history of the Linux, and it was released by the introduced by the Linus Torvalds from 1991 onwards. So that's regarding the history of the Linux. Now we have the Linux distributions, the components of that, and also the packages, as well as the distribution packages and some popular distributions and how to install the Ubuntu. Then we have the comparison between the Linux and Windows. So these topics will be discussed in the next class. So in this class we discussed about the Windows operating system, different versions of this Windows operating system, and also regarding the introduction for the Linux operating system. So that's for today. Thank you. Happy learning.